In 1853, workmen tearing down a section of Coldingham Abbey in Scotland broke through a section of wall that had stood untouched for centuries. Behind it, they found a narrow stone niche, just wide enough for a human body. Inside, a skeleton, curled, female, positioned upright as if she had been standing and simply stayed that way long after there was no longer anyone left inside her to stand. There was no coffin, no grave marker, no record of her name in the Abbey's books, just a gap in the wall, sized for a woman, sealed shut by men who never wrote down what they had done. By the end of this story, you'll understand the two words that were spoken before walls like this one were sealed, and why, for nearly 700 years, the Church did everything in its power to make sure no one outside ever heard them. To bring this story to life, we've used advanced AI restoration techniques on centuries-old engravings, court paintings, and the rare surviving sketches of convent interiors, turning flat, faded images into scenes you can actually step into. What you're about to see isn't just illustration, it's history, rendered as close to real as the records allow. And there's a reason this story needs to be seen, not just told, because what happened inside these walls wasn't whispered about by accident. It was buried on purpose by people with the power to make sure it stayed buried. If you want to see exactly how deep that secrecy went, including the Vatican's own attempt decades later to rewrite this history before the public could read it, subscribe now, because that's the story we're telling next, and it directly continues from where this video ends. There were two words in Latin: Vade in pace. Go in peace. It sounds like a blessing. It was a sentence. Picture the scene: a convent courtyard, sometime in the high medieval period. A nun stands before her abbess and a small gathering of senior clergy. She has been found guilty of breaking her vow of chastity, of heresy, of disobedience so severe the Church considers it a kind of spiritual death already. The abbess speaks the two words, Vade in pace, and then she is led not to a cell with a door, but to a wall. A space has already been prepared, a niche just large enough to hold a body, standing or curled. Inside, nothing but a narrow opening at chest height, wide enough to pass through a small ration of bread and water, nothing more. The historian Henry Charles Lee, who spent decades studying ecclesiastical court records, found one of the clearest documented cases. In the year 1246, a nun named Jeanne, the widow of a man named B. de la Tour, at a convent called Lespinasse, was convicted of heresy, Catharism, Waldensianism, and of lying about it during her confession. Her sentence wasn't execution, it was something the Church considered more merciful and arguably crueler: total isolation inside her own convent for the rest of her natural life. No one was permitted to enter her cell, no one was permitted to see her. Food was pushed through a small opening left in the wall for that single purpose. The record calls it confinement. Later writers gave it a darker name, the living tomb. So here is the question that should already be forming in your mind. If this was happening in 1246, recorded, documented, sentenced by name, how many other women went into walls like this one, with no Henry Charles Lee centuries later, to find their names at all?
For a long time, historians who wanted to dismiss this practice as exaggeration, Victorian ghost stories, anti-Catholic propaganda, nothing more, had one obvious argument: show me a real trial record, show me a name, a date, a sentence written down by the institution itself. In 1662, in the northern Italian city of Lodi, that record exists. Her name was Sister Antonia Margherita Limera. the charge. She had brought a man into her cell inside the convent and allowed him to stay there, not for an hour, not for a single reckless night, but for several days. We don't know his name. We don't know how she got him past the convent gates, or how long she believed she could keep the secret. What we do know is what happened when the secret ended. The convent did not simply expel her. It did not simply punish her with prayer, fasting, isolation in the ordinary sense. According to the surviving trial record studied by the historian Francesca Medioli, Sister Antonia Margherita Limera was sentenced to be walled in alive, sealed into a confined space within the convent itself, left to survive on nothing but bread and water for as long as her body could endure it. Think about the architecture of that sentence. It isn't designed to kill quickly. A quick death would almost be a kindness. It's designed to remove a person from the world slowly enough that everyone left outside the wall has time to feel the weight of what's happening on the other side of it, and to make sure no one ever forgets why. Lodi wasn't an isolated case either. That same period produced an almost identical sentence at a convent called San Salvatore in the town of Ariano, this time against a nun named Sister Vincenza Intanti and a cleric named Domenico Cagianella, both convicted together of breaking the convent's enclosure and engaging in a sexual relationship. Same charge, same punishment, different walls. 2 trials, 2 names, 2 convents hundreds of miles apart, arriving at the exact same sentence, which raises an uncomfortable question. Was this punishment written into church law somewhere, openly, as an accepted practice, or was it something each convent simply knew how to do, passed down quietly, generation to generation, without ever needing to write the instructions down at all?
Inside the church's own ecclesiastical records, this practice eventually got a name, not a euphemism invented by outsiders, a term the institution used about itself. Vade in pace, go in peace, shortened over time simply to the in pace. According to monastic history, the very first recorded use of this term is attributed to a 12th century prior named Matthew of St. Martin Dismartin, writing in an era when the church was rapidly building out its own internal justice system, courts, prisons, and punishments that operated entirely outside the reach of kings, sheriffs, or secular law. And that detail matters more than it might seem, because a monastery, a convent, an abbey, these weren't just religious houses. Under medieval law, they were sovereign in a way few institutions ever are. What happened inside those walls was the church's business, and the church's business alone. Which meant that when a woman went into an in-pace cell, there was no outside court to appeal to, no magistrate to petition, no family that could legally demand her release, even if they somehow learned where she had gone, and even if they had the courage to ask. The practice spread. Historical sources document in-pace cells in monasteries across Europe, at St. Albans Abbey in England, in Toulouse in southern France, at Lespinasse, at Lodi, at San Salvatore. Different countries, different centuries, the same architecture of disappearance repeating itself, almost like a blueprint passed quietly from one institution to the next. Some sentences lasted only days. Others, and this is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you, were handed down with no end date at all. Not until you repent, not until the bishop reviews your case, simply indefinite, until death, whenever death happened to arrive. Picture being the nun standing in that courtyard, hearing that sentence, not knowing if it means a week or 30 years.
Now, go back to where we started. Coldingham Abbey, Scotland, 1853. The abbey itself had a long, violent history, burned more than once, rebuilt, fought over during centuries of border conflict between Scotland and England. By the 19th century, much of it had crumbled into ruin, and the section being demolished that year was simply considered unstable, dangerous, not worth preserving. What the workmen found inside it was never meant to be found at all. A niche cut directly into the thickness of the wall, not a natural gap, not a void left by erosion, but a space deliberately shaped to hold something. And inside it, a skeleton, positioned in a way that historians who examined the find believed could only mean one thing. The body had been placed there upright, or curled tightly into the available space, while the wall was built or sealed around it. There was no coffin, no grave goods, no inscription, nothing that would normally accompany even the poorest medieval burial. And there's a reason that detail is so important. Even the most destitute person buried in the most neglected corner of a medieval churchyard usually received something: a shroud, a marked plot, a name entered into a parish register somewhere. This woman received none of it. Whoever placed her in that wall didn't intend for her to be found. They intended for her to vanish completely, body and memory both. The historical accounts that describe this discovery state plainly that the shape of the niche and the position of the remains matched exactly what earlier writers had described as the in pace, the immured nun. No name survives, no record explains who she was, what she had done, or how long she lived inside that wall before the abbey simply stopped delivering whatever scrap of food had once been pushed through the opening. We know almost nothing about her, and maybe that's the most disturbing fact in this entire story. Not that her death was cruel, but that her erasure was so complete it nearly worked. By the late 1800s, stories about walled-up nuns had become wildly popular outside the church. Novelists used the image, anti-Catholic pamphleteers used it even more, sometimes for genuine historical reasons, sometimes simply because it made for a useful weapon in religious arguments that had nothing to do with any actual nun in any actual convent anywhere. And one Catholic priest and historian, a Jesuit named Herbert Thurston, decided he'd had enough. Thurston went after the legend directly. He argued that the phrase in pace never referred to walling a person up alive in the literal sense, that so-called prison cells absolutely existed inside convents used to confine disobedient or refractory religious, but that these were ordinary confinement cells, not sealed tombs. He picked apart famous literary sources one by one, including Sir Walter Scott's poem Marmion, which had done more than almost anything else to popularize the Coldingham legend in the first place, and argued that popular writers had taken a real, if grim, practice of monastic imprisonment and exaggerated it into something closer to horror fiction. He had a point. Some of the most lurid stories were exaggerated, fueled by 19th century anti-Catholic sentiment, illustrated with sensational skeleton photographs designed to shock Protestant audiences rather than inform them. But here's what Thurston's argument couldn't explain away: the trial record from Lodi in 1662, the case from San Salvatore, the sentence handed down to Jeanne of Lespinasse in 1246. These weren't novels, they weren't Victorian pamphlets. They were the Church's own legal records describing the Church's own sentences in the Church's own words. So which is it? Was the walled-up nun a real, if rare, practice?
documented in actual trials across multiple countries over more than 4 centuries? Or was she primarily a legend, one that grew so much louder than the historical truth that even serious historians, generations later, are still arguing about where the line between the two actually sits? Maybe the most honest answer is the most uncomfortable one. Both things are true at once. The practice was real, and the legend grew so large around it that separating fact from folklore, case from rumor, became nearly impossible. Which may be exactly what generations of silence were designed to accomplish in the first place.
If there's one case that shows exactly how this entire system worked, trial, confinement, public memory, and the church's instinct to control the story afterward, it's the case known to history as the Nun of Monza. Her real name was Marianna de Leyva. Born into a noble Milanese family in the late 16th century, she was placed in a convent as a child, not from devotion, but because her family had decided, as so many noble families did, that they could not afford to provide dowries for multiple daughters. One daughter would marry, the others would disappear into the church, whether they wanted to or not. Marianna became a nun, and eventually she became the prioress of her convent, a position of real authority. But behind the walls she now helped govern, she began a secret affair with a nobleman, one that produced not scandal alone, but actual children. When the truth came out, the consequences were severe even by the standards of the era. Marianna was tried by ecclesiastical authorities, and the sentence handed down to her was immurement, confinement, sealed away from the outside world for what the court intended to be the remainder of her life. For years, that's exactly what happened to her. But Marianna's story has an ending that most of the women in this video never received. She survived. After serving somewhere between 10 and 15 years in that confinement, she was eventually released back into convent life, living out the rest of her days as a nun, diminished, transformed by what she had endured, but alive. Centuries later, the Italian novelist Alessandro Manzoni would take her story and fictionalize it in his novel The Betrothed, turning her into one of the most famous literary nuns in Italian history. Films would dramatize her story too, and many of them quietly changed the ending, making her confinement permanent, a life sentence with no release, because that ending was simply more dramatically satisfying than the truth. Which means that even Marianna de Leyva, one of the only women in this entire story whose name we actually know, whose fate we can actually trace from trial to release, has had her real story rewritten by the very people telling it. If that can happen to a documented noblewoman with a name, a trial record, and a release date, what chance did an anonymous nun in an unmarked niche at Coldingham ever have of being remembered accurately?
So let's go back to the wall. Coldingham Abbey, 1853. Workmen with hammers and crowbars taking apart a ruin nobody thought was worth saving. And then stone falling away to reveal a space that was never meant to be opened again. We opened this video with a question. What happened inside places like this? And why did the people who built them spend centuries making sure no one outside ever heard about it? Here is the answer, as close as the historical record allows us to get to it. What happened was not legend. It was not Victorian exaggeration, dreamed up by novelists looking to scandalize Protestant readers. It was a real, documented, repeatedly used form of ecclesiastical punishment, confirmed not by outsiders, but by the Church's own trial records in Lespinasse in 1246, in Lodi in 1662, in San Salvatore in the very same year. Real names, real sentences, real walls. And the reason it stayed hidden for so long wasn't an accident of history. It was the entire point of the system. A monastery operated outside secular law. There was no outside court to appeal to, no magistrate who could intervene, no family with any legal power to demand answers, even a family that loved their daughter enough to ask where she had gone. The silence wasn't a side effect. The silence was the punishment. That's why the woman in the Coldingham wall has no name, not because no one ever knew it, someone somewhere certainly did, but because the entire architecture of this practice was built to make sure that knowledge died with the people who held it, generation after generation, until eventually there was no one left who remembered at all. She stood in that wall, in the dark, for however many days her body could endure it. And then the world outside simply moved on, brick by brick, century by century, until 1853, when a few workmen with no idea what they were about to find broke through a wall that had kept her secret far longer than anyone had ever lived.
What this story leaves you with isn't really about convents or even about the church specifically. It's about what happens when an institution is given total, unquestioned power over the people inside it. Power so complete that even disappearance itself can become a sentence, carried out quietly with no outside witness required. The women in this story weren't murdered in some dramatic, singular act of violence. They were simply removed, slowly, legally, with paperwork and Latin phrases, and convent walls thick enough to make sure no sound ever reached the other side. And for centuries, that was enough to make sure the world never had to reckon with what had been done. But walls do come down eventually. Records do surface, centuries later than anyone intended. And every name we've managed to recover in this story, Jeanne of Lespinasse, Antonia Margherita Limera, Marianna de Leyva, is proof that erasure, however carefully built, is never quite as permanent as the people who built it believed. There is one more piece of this story we haven't told you yet. What happened decades later, when the Vatican itself became aware that these records were starting to surface and made a quiet, deliberate decision about what the public would and would not be allowed to know. That's the story we're telling next. Because some walls were built from stone, and some were built from silence. And silence, it turns out, is so much harder to take apart.